really good at forgetting. Excellent. So thank you so much, Philip. I'd like to hand over to you now for talking about the research on your book, D.H. Lawrence in Search of Utopia.
Well, thank you, Joni. Thank you for that great introduction. I won't live up to that promise, of course, but that's all right. As you said, I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes or whatever it is talking about my new book, D.H. Lawrence and Cornwall in Search of Utopia is the subtitle. If I hold it up, can you see it there? Maybe there it is. That's it. As I keep saying, oh, it's back the front. As I keep saying to people, great picture, pity about the words. What I want to do is I've got my trademark card, backs of envelopes here, just to talk a little bit about the book itself, and then to give you something, a taster of the story itself, what it is about, what does the book actually go on about. Those who know a little bit about the sort of stuff that I have been writing will know that over the years, and goodness, it is the years, one of the themes I've pursued is what you might call Cornish biographies. I started off with a book on A.L. Rouse some years ago, which I subtitled A Paradoxical Patriot, which I thought sounded quite clever at the time. Now looking back, I think it's a bit of a mouthful. But I wanted to write about A.L. Rouse, the historian, the man of letters, and his indeed paradoxical relationship with Cornwall. And it seemed to go down rather well. So I was persuaded, or at least I persuaded myself, to do a similar but different thing on John Betjeman, who, unlike Rouse, was not Cornish in the sense of birth or whatever, although in his identification, he was overwhelmingly linked with Cornwall. And that book I called John Betjeman and Cornwall, the Celebrated Cornish Nationalist, because John Betjeman tried to assume, sometimes tongue-in-cheek, but at times definitely not tongue-in-cheek, a Cornish nationalist disposition. So I tried to come up with subtitles that reflected the themes of those two, what I might call Cornish biographies. And that leads me to this one, D.H. Lawrence in Cornwall. D.H. Lawrence is, well, I think he's bonkers, actually. And although I've done quite a lot of research and reading for this, I haven't really revised my opinion. I think he is strangely mercurial in all sorts of ways. And the relationship that he developed with Cornwall, I've summed up I hope, in this subtitle, which I called In Search of Utopia. Quite what I mean by that and how it developed, I'll begin to say in just a moment. I've alighted at last on D.H. Lawrence, having, as I said, been interested in him and his relationship with Cornwall over a long period of time. Some of you might even have spotted in jumble sales and second-hand bookshops a small pamphlet I wrote on the subject in, I think, 2009. Which, well, even if it didn't whet anybody else's appetite, it kind of whetted mine, and I've been bumping along with Lawrence, as it were, ever since. But one of the things that you may have noticed, that I've certainly noticed, that is in the last decade or so, D.H. Lawrence has been, if you like, rehabilitated within not only the academic world, but within mainstream cultural appreciation with the reading public and so on. For a long time, he was persona non grata, particularly in the eyes of the feminist movement, but in kind of English literary studies generally. And it's only recently that people have come back to him and said, okay, well, let's try to understand him a little bit better. In the words of Jonathan Long, who's a leading Lawrence scholar, as he puts it, in the 21st century, Lawrence studies has moved beyond defensiveness, which is where it has landed itself in the 70s and the 80s and into the 90s, In the 21st century, Lawrence studies has moved beyond defensiveness and is beginning to come to terms with inconvenient aspects of his life and work, which I think is right. I mean, there's a lot about Lawrence and his life and work, which is definitely inconvenient, not least from a Cornish perspective. And it's useful just to confront that inconvenience and try to make something of it, which is one of the things that I hope I've done in this book. Some of this inconvenience, some of this complex attitude of D.H. Lawrence was his attitude to Indigenous people, which was mercurial, paradoxical. In one sense, he sympathized with Indigenous peoples, particularly those he saw as having been marginalized by modern industrial urban society, particularly English, but not necessarily English, equally American in his view, or indeed, as he found out later on, Australian as well. So he sympathized with Indigenous peoples. And that eventually he ended up in Mexico and then in New Mexico. But at the same time as expressing that sympathy, he couldn't really escape his own colonialist assumptions and colonialist attitudes, which of course were typical of the time. And so he vacillated between sympathy for marginalized people and sometimes a certain contempt for them. And that's probably not too strong a word, reflecting some of the inconsistencies in his own approach to those people. Part of this relationship with Indigenous people is what Julian Moynihan, who's another Lawrence scholar, writing as long ago as the 1970s actually, has called D.H. Lawrence's cult of the Celt. Well, it alliterates, doesn't it? And he says that in Lawrence's work, he says there's the continuing attraction he shows, that's Lawrence shows, in his artistic productions, books and so on, and in his life for the characters, themes and scenes drawn from the Celtic fringe of Scotland, Wales, Cornwall and Ireland. And it's true, I think, that amongst his views of Indigenous people, Lawrence does indeed exhibit this cult of the Celt. He finds himself writing about Irish themes and Scottish themes, and then amongst that, Cornish themes as well. But as ever with Lawrence, there is an ambiguity, there are ambiguities. He shares some of the conflicting English conceptions of the Celt in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. At times he sees them as exasperating, feckless, unable to manage their own affairs, but at other times he sees the Celts as being actually something rather grand, that the Celtic people have. They have a magical quality, a dreamlike quality which raises them above, for example, the stolidness of the Englishness. So he both reveres the Celts, but is also at times incredibly irritated by them as well. And that dichotomy comes across, I hope, in the book, in the way that I deal with Lawrence's approach to the Cornish in particular, but it also reflects the dichotomy that he feels between what he sees as a majestic Celtic tradition, which he discerns beneath the surface, not least in Cornwall, and the reality of what he actually finds, which certainly in the case of Cornwall, he finds a kind of hidebound, non-conformist utilitarianism, and he becomes very angry that when he is in Cornwall, he doesn't see this great Celtic tradition shining through, and is instead confronted time and again by this hidebound, non-conformist utilitarianism. Lawrence had long enthused about the King Arthur legend. He was a great fan of Tennyson, He knew about Robert Stephen Hawker, Vicar of Morwenstow, and his Arthurian poetry. And he saw Cornwall, particularly North Cornwall, as Arthur's realm, as Tristan's land. And one of the things that's quite often overlooked about D.H. Lawrence is that in 1910, he applied for a job in North Cornwall. He was drawn to the idea of Cornwall, even in 1910, as another place, as somewhere that was unsullied by English industrial urban modernity. That in Cornwall, he might find somewhere where he could escape from all that. He saw Cornwall, this is an important point, as beyond England and beyond England's cultural reach, if you like. And he thought that in going to teach in North Cornwall, he would be able to escape that suffocating urban industrial society, which he increasingly loathed in England. In the end, he didn't submit the application because his then fiancée, Louis Burrows, poured cold water on it. She didn't want to go to North Cornwall. Perhaps significant that the engagement between Lawrence and Louis Burrows did not last, and he cut off the engagement fairly shortly afterwards. He didn't forget about Cornwall, though, and although the 1910 job application came to nothing, he didn't forget about Cornwall, and nor did he lose sight of Cornwall as a potential site for building a life beyond the reach of English urban industrial society as he understood it. In 1915, the war had broken out, the First World War. It was also the year in which his book, for which he held great hopes, The Rainbow, was actually banned on the grounds of obscenity. So 1915 was a bad year for D.H. Lawrence. His book was banned and a lot of his hopes therefore were dashed. And at the same time, he was appalled by the outbreak of the First World War, which he saw as not only a calamity, but he saw it as being the inevitable result of industrial urban society. Modern mechanized warfare was the result, the inevitable result of that society, and which he saw of that urban industrial society, which he saw as madness. This redoubled his sense of needing to escape from all that. He needed to escape from the England that had banned his books and was stilting his literary endeavor, but he also needed to escape from the all-encompassing war. He thought about going to America. He had a plan to go to Florida. He was friends with an up-and-coming musician, Philip Heseltine, who in turn was friends with the composer Delius, who had a property, ramshackle property in Florida. And there was a plan that together they might go off with a few friends and settle in Florida and set up something like a utopian community. But with the war on, the idea of going to America was dashed. So in a sense, Lawrence descended upon Cornwall. He chose Cornwall not necessarily as the second best to Florida, to America, but because it was accessible, it was doable, and it had always been in his mind as the sort of place where he could set up an alternative society. What was this alternative society? Well, he had alighted upon the phrase Rana Nim, and it's a phrase that stuck with him. He used it to describe his utopian community. He didn't always articulate what that utopian community might actually look like, and it seems that his view of what it was actually changed, sometimes subtly, sometimes radically, over time. But essentially, in a fairly fuzzy kind of way, he wanted to create a community of like-minded people who were of artistic and literary bent, who saw the world through the same lens that he did, and would work together in some kind of communal harmony to create the sort of community which would reject urban industrial values. The name Rana Nim itself came from, well, suggested unwittingly, really, by Samuel Koteliansky, known rather reassuringly as Kot, to his friends, who was a Ukrainian Jew, an emigre in England, who, according to Lawrence, used to sing these Ukrainian come Russian folk songs, one of which had this phrase, this wording, Rananim, which rather appealed to Lawrence in its sort of mystical sense, and he adopted it as the name for his utopian community. And it's a word that he uses all the time and crops up all the time, not least in terms of what he is trying to achieve in Cornwall. So he looks to Cornwall, and when he is offered the chance of taking a lease on a cottage, or actually a rather large cottage at Porthcotton near Padstow in North Cornwall, he leaps at the chance. He sees this as a way of escaping from all the setbacks that he has suffered personally in England, and also from the dreaded war spirit. It's worth saying at this point that Lawrence considered that the war spirit which he imagined had engulfed England had not yet engulfed Cornwall. He saw Cornwall as being beyond the English war spirit, as he described it. And in a sense, he was right. The knowledge of and enthusiasm for the war in Cornwall was noticeably lukewarm, particularly in the early days of the war, in 14 and 15 and the early parts of 2016. And so he comes to Cornwall, to the cottage at remote Porthcotton near Padstow in North Cornwall, and he is delighted. This is exactly the place that he was looking for. He has found the makings of Rananim, of Utopia. This is where things are going to be built up. And just read you a couple of things that he wrote at that time. What does he do? He writes to the owner of the cottage, a chap called Beresford, and he tells him that I do like Cornwall, he writes, having settled in. He says, it is still something like King Arthur and Tristan. It has never taken the Anglo-Saxon civilization, the Anglo-Saxon sort of Christianity. One can feel free here, feel that the world as it was in that flicker of pre-Christian Celtic civilization, when humanity was really young. And so he goes on. It almost develops into a kind of mantra. He writes to all his literary and intellectual friends, saying basically the same kind of thing. He writes to Catherine Carswell, who is a Scottish author and drama critic. He says, I like Cornwall very much. It is not England. It is bare and dark and elemental, Tristan's land. I lie looking down at a cove where the waves come white under a low black headland, which slopes up in a bare green brown, bare and sad under a level sky. It is old, Celtic, pre-Christian, Tristan and his boat and his horn, and so on and so forth. And he writes this time and time again. Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, he says, I like being here very much. Cornwall isn't England. It really isn't England, nor Christendom. It has another quality of King Arthur's days, that flicker of Celtic consciousness before it was swamped under Norman and Teutonic waves. And so on he goes. He's reading at this time a number of books about Celtic civilization, Celtic symbolism. And one of those is a book by Kitty Lee Jenner, Mrs. Henry Jenner, as she calls herself, her nom de plume, who was, of course, the wife of Henry Jenner, the Cornish language revivalist. And there is an interesting link, because Mrs. Henry Jenner talks about Christian symbolism. She relates, as she sees it, Celtic symbolism to the symbolism of the East. And one of her key symbols in that is the phoenix. She adopts the phoenix as kind of her one of her personal symbols. And D.H. Lawrence, at his time in Porthcotton, he also alights upon the phoenix, taking it from Mrs. Henry Jenner and uses it as his personal symbolism, but also as his symbolism for Rana Nim. So there are connections here between the vision of Rana Nim and its symbolism and what Lawrence is reading, as well as what he is experiencing there on the North Cornish coast. He is, as he admits, inspired by, as he puts it, a Celtic vision, and yet, despite all that, and I can read you a bit more. He displays his underlying ambivalence about Indigenous people. On the one hand, he is so thrilled to be in Cornwall, as you have heard. It seems to fit all his preconceived ideas of what Celtic Cornwall, Arthurian Cornwall, pre-Christian Cornwall, whatever you want to call it, ought to look like. But at the same time, he's actually not very convinced about the people. Are they living up to that high standard, that high expectation? Probably not. He writes again to Bertrand Russell, a philosopher, still from Porthcotton in North Cornwall, and he admits that there is already in his mind a conflict, if you like, a contradiction between Lawrence's idealized imaginings of the Cornish Celts and the actual people that he was encountering on a day-to-day basis roundabout. And as he puts it to Bertrand Russell, he had hoped, he said, that there really might be rock-hurling giants and odd pixies, if only the Cornish hadn't become foully and ugly Wesleyan. Alas, alas. So there we are. We have again that sense of this contradiction between the Cornish really are the inheritors of this great Celtic tradition, Arthurianism, and all the rest of it, and yet they've allowed themselves to embrace this hidebound, nonconformist utilitarianism. They have become ugly Wesleyan. They have kind of let themselves and their tradition and their heritage down. And expands on this as best he can to Bertrand Russell. And he says, repeating some of the things he said before, I like Cornwall very much. I like the people also. They've got a curious softness and intimacy. I think they've lived just the opposite principle to Christianity, self-fulfillment and social destruction instead of social love and self-sacrifice. So here in Cornwall, there's no social structure hardly, and people have hardly any social self, only the immediate, intimate self. That's why they're so generally disliked. And that's why there were wreckers and smugglers and antisocial things. And that's why the roads are too dodgy to be grasped. And that's why there is such a lovely, intimate softness in the women. All that's pretty contradictory. Well, the roads that are too dodgy to be grasped, well, one understands that. But some of the other stuff here is pretty modelled. There are similar inconsistencies and contradictions when he wrote to Barbara Lowe, another of his literary friends. At last I have found a place where some of the men and women really love each other, with a fine softness and rareness that delights me. The women are so soft and so wise and so attractive, a quality of winsomeness and rare unconscious female soothingness and fertility of being. I would marry a Cornish woman. But some of the men are detestably small-eyed and mean, real cunning-nosed peasants, mean as imbeciles. So again, curious contradictions. He writes to Beresford, J.D. Beresford, from whom he's hiring the cottage. He writes on the 1st of February 1916. He's been there a little while now. The Cornish people still attract me, but they become detestable, I think. And yet they aren't detestable. They are, of course, strictly antisocial and unchristian. But then the aristocratic principle and the principle of magic to which they belonged, these two have collapsed and left only the most ugly, scaly, insect-like, unclean selfishness, so that each of them is like an insect isolated within its own scaly, glassy envelope and seeking its own small end. And how foul that is, and how they stink in their repulsiveness. Nonetheless, he goes on to say, nevertheless, the old race is still revealed, a race which believed in the darkness, in magic, and in the magic transcendency of one man over another, which is fascinating, and so on and so forth. And this vacillation between two imaginings of the Cornish goes on and on and on. And he repeats it to all who kind of would listen. I think it's worth saying as well that Lawrence at this stage was actually quite ill. Although his TB, which would eventually kill him, was yet to be formally diagnosed, he was often ill, feverish and ranting. So in amongst his rather peculiar estimations of the Cornish here, one remembers that he was ill. And that prevented him actually from getting out and about very much. As he put it, he went out in the motor now and again, and as he said, he didn't see much of them, but you'll know what they're like, he said. Now, to make matters worse for Lawrence, not only was that initial conception of a Celtic potential utopia beginning to crumble as he got to know in his own light what Cornish people were really like, so those people he had tried to attract to Rana Nim, who had encouraged to come down, began to wonder about what they were actually joining. Principal amongst those was a name that I mentioned already, Philip Heseltine, the up-and-coming young composer, who actually went on to learn the Cornish language, to compose carols in the Cornish language along with Henry Jenner, and to learn other Celtic languages as well. He had come down to join Lawrence in high hopes of helping to build this utopian community, but increasingly found Lawrence difficult to deal with, not surprisingly, given some of the things that we heard. And eventually, Heseltine falls out with Lawrence, and he decides that this is all too much for him, and he's going to go back to London. And he writes to Delius, his friend, trying to explain what has gone on. He says, having gone to London, he says, I'm not returning to Lawrence. He has no real sympathy. All he likes in one is a potential convert to his reactionary creed. I believe firmly that he is a fine thinker and a consummate artist, but personal relationship with him is almost impossible. So it seemed already that despite all those high hopes, despite all that enthusiasm, despite Cornwall being not England, despite it having that Celtic, Arthurian, pre-Christian flicker of civilization, nonetheless, it had fallen apart. The Cornish people had not lived up to Lawrence's expectations, and those people notably Philip Heseltine, who had been drawn down to Cornwall, had been repulsed by what they had found, that Run was not the kind of utopian community that they thought that they were going to create. And Heseltine, as you have heard, goes back to London, and Run, it seems, is collapsing. And at the same time, the short lease on the cottage at Porthcofn is running out. And so Lawrence has to make a decision about what he's going to do next. And paradoxically, intriguingly, despite his experiences, despite some of his disappointments, he decides that he will go further west into Cornwall, that he needs to go further west to find that real Celtic Cornwall, which he knows is out there, but which is proving elusive. And so he moves down to Zena in West Penwith in the far west. He writes as he arrives in Zena in much the same way that he wrote when he was at Porthcofn. He thinks it's wonderful. He writes to the literary duo, John Middleton Murray and Catherine Mansfield, to tell them that, as he put it, when I looked down on Zena, I knew it was the promised land, and that a new heaven and a new earth would take place. So despite all his experiences from before, he's forgotten about all that. This is going to be Run. This is going to be where Utopia can be built. This is the place. He has gone further west to find the real Celtic Cornwall. Interestingly, all his enthusiasm for Arthurian Cornwall, for Tristan's land, all that's tied up with North Cornwall, Tintagel and all the rest of it. In moving to Zena, in moving to the far west, his conception of this idealized Celtic Cornwall shifts and becomes less Arthurian, less Tintagel focused, and more to do with what he sees as an underlying Celtic mythology. He becomes interested in how the Phoenicians are tied up with the far west of Cornwall. He becomes interested in folklore, a bit more about that in a moment. And as I say, he becomes entranced by the idea of Celtic mythology, which he can read, feel in the landscape. Again, I'll read you another little book, another little piece from the book. Where are we? Yeah. He writes about Zena and environments as being, as he calls it, the twilight awesome world of the previous Celts, the spirit of the ancient pre-Christian world, which lingers still in these truly Celtic places. The old Celtic countries never had our Latin Teutonic consciousness, never will have. They have never been Christian in the blue-eyed or even truly Roman Latin sense of the world, but they have been overlaid by our consciousness and our civilization, but smouldering underneath in a slow, eternal fire. And it was that slow, eternal fire that he wished to identify and to tap and to identify with. As he put it, Cornwall is a country that makes a man psychic. The longer he stayed, the more intense it had that effect on Summers, who is his alter ego in the novel Kangaroo, about which more in a moment. It was as if he were developing second sight and second hearing. He would go out into the blackness of night and listen to the blackness and call softly for the spirits, the presences he felt coming downhill from the moors in the night. Tuatha De Danann, he would call softly, invoking the pre-Celtic gods of Irish mythology. Tuatha De Danann, be with me, be with me. And it was as if he felt them come. I'll say a little bit more about Kangaroo, the novel, in the moment, and also about his alter ego, Richard Lovett Summers. But for the moment, I think it's useful to note that in that landscape, Zena, which is, those of you who know Zena will know it's a pretty unique kind of landscape. He felt close to this Celtic mythology that he had been trying to identify with. I mentioned folklore as well. And one of the aspects of local folklore that enchanted Lawrence was the story of the mermaid of Zena. He visited the church frequently. He saw there the mermaid bench end, which had been salvaged and refurbished when the church had been rebuilt at the end of the 19th century, refurbished at the end of the 19th century. And he knew the tale of the mermaid of Zena. He knew the story of Matthew Trewella, who had been seduced beneath the waves by the mermaid herself. The story is that Matthew Trewella sang in the choir in Zena church, and that the mermaid, cleverly disguised, one day came to the church and managed to seduce Matthew Trewella down into the sea, down at the cove below. And it was a story that tantalized, impressed D.H. Lawrence. And if you look at his book, Kangaroo, which is set in Australia, as its name suggests, but much of which is based in Cornwall, and much of which is autobiographical in content. One of the key characters there is a Cornish immigrant called James Trewella, or Jas Trewella, as he is known to his colleagues in Australia. Jas Trewella is a Cornish immigrant. He has gone to Australia, where he has done rather well. But D.H. Lawrence's alter ego, Richard Lovett Summers, the protagonist in the book, thinks that actually Jas Trewella has betrayed his Celtic origins, that he has somehow turned his back unnecessarily, wrongly, on Cornwall. And that makes him think about aspects of the nature of Cornish immigration, but also aspects again of that, what I have called that hidebound non-conformist identity that the Cornish had adopted as D.H. Lawrence put it, as an alternative to their rather more majestic Celtic tradition. And so Jas Trewella is someone who, not enticed down under the waves, but has been enticed down under to Australia. And there's an interesting parallel there, I think, between Jas Trewella and his role in the story Kangaroo, and his own life story in Australia, compared with Matthew Trewella, who's been enticed under the sea by the mermaid. And just as we might question whether Matthew Trewella, in being enticed under the waves, taken out of his natural habitat into the depths of the sea, is actually really happy? Probably not. And is Jas Trewella, having been taken out of his natural habitat in Cornwall and ostensibly doing rather well in Australia, is he happy? Probably not. And therein, for D.H. Lawrence, is a comparison. That's a little bit of as a tangent, but I think it's important to note that at this stage, because it shows the extent to which Lawrence was finding himself immersed in Zena and its folklore in a way that had actually escaped him in North Cornwall. Here were aspects of connection which had eluded him in his earlier existence up at Porthcotton. He writes to that literary duo, Murray and Mansfield, Jack Murray and Catherine Mansfield, from Higher Tregarthen, which is where he has rented some cottages in Zena up on the heights. And he's imploring them to join him. They are to be the new recruits for Rhiannon Reborn. And he writes with purple prose, and he says that what they can construct, what they will build together will be, as he puts it, like a little monastery. We will eat together, share expenses. It would be so splendid if it could but come off. Such a lovely place, our Run and Im. And I think that Murray and Mansfield are themselves seduced by this rather purple praise. They know D.H. Lawrence of old, as it were, and they decide that they will give Run and Im a go, that they will go down to Zena and sample the delights that D.H. Lawrence has sketched for them, and to join him in that community. But when they actually get there, they find that it's not like the place that Lawrence had sketched for them. They actually arrive on a bleak and rainy day, so there is not the sun and the blue seas and all the rest of it that Lawrence had described. There is just mist and damp, penetrating rain. And the cottage that Lawrence has prepared for them runs with damp. More than that, Lawrence himself is again ill. He's raving, and all the gentle words that have been used to entice Murray and Mansfield down to Zena are kind of forgotten, at least some of the time. And there are tensions, there are arguments, and in the end, Murray and Mansfield decide that they have had enough of this, and they depart after about 6 weeks. They go down to Myla near Falmouth in the more gentle climes of South Cornwall. Lawrence and his wife Frida go down to see them there. They patch things up. They part on friendly terms, but it's never going to be the same again. It seems that Run and Im is already crumbling. Philip Heseltine, who we saw had given up on Lawrence for all time, has second thoughts, and he comes down and he's going to give it a second go. He entices other friends to join him at Zena, and there's another go at making Run and Im. This time, however, Heseltine gets call-up papers. Conscription is being introduced in the UK, except for Ireland. And Heseltine decides that he needs to seek an escape route and leaves immediately for Ireland, abandoning, I think that's probably the right word, abandoning Lawrence. And so that, once again, Philip Heseltine is abandoning Lawrence, and the little kernel of Run and Im that is beginning to come together is beginning to crumble already. By now, conscription, as I say, has been introduced, and Cornwall, which has been very much outside the grip, if that's the right word, of the English war spirit, as Lawrence has described it, becomes inevitably more embroiled. Local people are receiving their call-up papers. Lawrence himself has to go to Bodmin, where he is examined with a view to conscripting him into the armed forces. But not surprisingly, the examining doctor recognizes the weakness of his chest and his precarious health, and he is exempted from military service. But still, the whole experience is for Lawrence a profound shock, and for him is evidence of the war spirit beginning to intrude on Cornwall. Not only is Run and Im the utopian construct crumbling just as it did before, but now the war spirit promises to envelop everything. I'll read you that bit about the call-up because I think it is interesting. And again, it gives an insight into Lawrence's psyche. He writes to his friend Dolly Radford, yet another of those intellectual friends, and he says, I've just come back from Bodmin. Yesterday, I had to go and join the colours in Penzance. They conveyed me to Bodmin, a distance of 50 or 60 miles. We were kept, 30 poor devils, in the barracks all night and treated like incipient soldiers. Luckily, I got a total exemption and am home again. But it was a great shock, that barracks experience, that being escorted by train, lined up on a station platform, marched like a criminal through the streets to the barracks. The ignominy is horrible. The humiliation, what a degradation and a prison. Oh, intolerable. I could not bear it. I should die in a week if they made me a soldier. 30 men in their shirts being weighed like sheep, one after another. Oh, God. I beg all my stars that I may never see Bodmin again. Know the feeling. I hate it so much. And, well, pretty strong stuff. And added to that, though, was the growth of U-boat activity, submarine activity around the Cornish coast. And from being somewhere that had been more or less cocooned from the war being something over there, something that was impacting upon places other than Cornwall, suddenly Cornwall becomes a major maritime battleground. And all around, particularly the far western coasts of Cornwall, there is a daily battle going on between the U-boats, which are sinking Allied shipping at an alarming rate, often within sight of the Cornish coast, and the Royal Navy, which has patrol boats, armed trawlers, airships, and other mechanisms for hunting and destroying the U-boats. And this battle is going on within sight and sound of the communities which hitherto had felt themselves to be cocooned from a war that was happening a long way away. Local opinion was alarmed by the U-boat threat. Local people imagined all sorts of things, that the U-boats would creep silently into Cornish coves at night, and land raiding parties, which would descend upon the farms and slit the throats of local people while they slept. There were rather lurid stories of submarines slipping into coves and of U-boat German officers coming ashore silently in civilian clothing and dining in local hotels in Penzance and St Ives, and then slipping back to their U-boats in the morning and going to sea. And incredible as it seems now, people then believed these stories. They thought it could happen, and they thought, they had a kind of insolent rage against the arrogance and insolence of these supposed German officers who were creeping ashore just like this. A.L. Rouse, a historian, himself recorded one such story about U-boat officers coming ashore. And only yesterday I was reading the memoir by Breyer, her nom de plume, and she had a story that went around on the Isles of Scilly during the First World War, that a U-boat commander had come ashore and let it be known that on several occasions he had taken his submarine under the keel of the Lioness, which was the ship that used to ply between Penzance and St Mary's, excuse me, in the Isles of Scilly, rather as the Solonian does today. But out of the goodness of his heart, had decided not to sink it. Such was the lurking menace of the U-boat threat and the way in which that was perceived in Cornwall and indeed in the Isles of Scilly. And this is as Lawrence tells us. The town was buzzing. 2 German submarine officers had come into the town, dressed in clothes they had taken from an English ship they had sunk. They had stayed a night at the Mounts Bay Hotel. And 2 days later, they had told the story to 2 fishermen whose fishing boat they had stopped. They had shown the incredulous fishermen the hotel bill. They had sunk the fishing boat, sending the 3 fishermen ashore in a rowing boat. This was just a story. I mean, but this was a story that went round, one of several that was believed in the local community. Huge amount of fear, suspicion, rumor, innuendo. And in the end, Lawrence became a victim of that. He was known as a rather strange character. His wife, Frida, was German. And her Germanness was fairly obvious. And it became plain that she was a cousin of the Red Baron, the German air ace. So there was an innate suspicion of what on earth was Lawrence doing with a German wife? Why was he here in the far west of Cornwall, in sight and sound of this battle, raging battles that were going on just off the Cornish coast? What was his agenda? People began to imagine that he was a German spy. So that when he tarred his chimney at Higher Tregarthen, that was seen as being a signal to U-boats at sea. When people smelt petrol, which is actually from oil drums that had been washed up from sunk ships, this was taken as being evidence that there were secret fuel dumps managed by Lawrence so that the U-boats could refuel without having to go back to base or whatever. I think at first the authorities didn't take a lot of notice of this kind of gossip, which was going on all around the British coast, albeit intensified around the West Cornish coast because of the peculiar nature of that U-boat battle. But I think what did it for D.H. Lawrence was his friendship with an American journalist called Robert Mountseer, who came to Britain and to Ireland at the end of 1960, beginning of 1917, ostensibly to talk about British and Irish literary activity, but as it turned out, as a journalist writing about first of all, about pacifism and opposition to the war in Britain and in Ireland, and also to talk about aspects of Britain's war effort, not least the extent to which Britain's food supplies were in danger of being seriously disrupted by the very submarine warfare that was being conducted at that moment around the Cornish coast and the British coast generally. And that, I think, is what got the British authorities worried about Lawrence. It wasn't the local people and their ill-informed suspicions. It was the reality of this relationship with Robert Mountseer, the American journalist, who went back, or who actually wrote articles for the American press about indicating potential food shortages in Britain and so on and so forth. And Robert Mountseer was actually arrested by the British authorities and then sent back to the United States. Lawrence seemed a bit oblivious to all this, and indeed Mountseer became his American agent in the years ahead. So, another of Lawrence's oddity. But what happened now that the British state had taken an interest, is that Lawrence was summarily expelled from Cornwall. Again, this is something that Lawrence captures in his book Kangaroo. And again, I'll just read you a little bit about what he wrote, which I think captures absolutely the kind of the trauma experienced by Lawrence at that moment of expulsion. Lawrence and Frida had been out for the day and they had come back. In the story in Kangaroo, Richard Lovett Summers is the alter ego of Lawrence, and his wife is called not Frida, but Harriet. They live not at Higher Tregarthen, but at Trevethen, but it's all the same story. When they come back to the cottage, Summers, for which read Lawrence, and Harriet, for which read Frida, find that there is a policeman and an army major waiting for them. Summers, for which read Lawrence, white and very still, spoke no word but waited. Then the police sergeant, in rather stumbling fashion, began to read an order from the military authority that Richard Lovett Summers and Harriet Emma Mariana Johanna Summers of Trevethan Cottage, etc., should leave the county of Cornwall within the space of 3 days, and further, within the space of 24 hours of their arrival in any place, they must report themselves at the police station of the said place, giving their address. And they were forbidden to enter any part of the area of Cornwall, etc., etc., etc. But why? Cried Harriet. Why? What have we done? I can't say what you have done, said the young officer in a cold tone, but it must be something sufficiently serious. They don't send out these orders for nothing. And in this way, Lawrence was expelled summarily from Cornwall, and had a great effect upon him. He began his wanderings almost immediately around the globe. He went back to London initially, but before long he was en route to Ceylon. He liked Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka. He liked the nighttime jungle noises. But he recognised that the climate was bad for his health, or so he said, and so he went on to Australia. He had long been interested in Australia. He'd been particularly interested, as he thought it, primitive Aboriginal society, one of those indigenous groups who have both escaped the impact of urban industrial society and yet had suffered as a result of it. And he felt about the Australian Aboriginals, much as he felt about the Celtic peoples with the same ambivalence, and as he would go on to feel about the indigenous peoples of Mexico and New Mexico. Initially, he might have thought of Australia as a potential destination for Ananim. There's a hint of that. But when he gets there, he arrives at Fremantle, and he immediately thinks that here is a mirror image of English urban industrial society. And although he enthuses about the bush, and although he, in a sense, falls in love with Australia, he knows that it cannot be for him. And after a relatively short stay in Australia, he resumes his journeys, ending up in Mexico and New Mexico. So ultimately, Australia is also a disappointment. But he spent a great deal of his time in Australia writing his novel Kangaroo, which is set against the background of Australia. The Australian bush features in it in a very authentic way. He captures the mood of contemporary Australian politics in a way which is quite remarkable, but a great part of Kangaroo reflects upon his experiences in Cornwall and is reflected to some extent in his dialogue with Jas Trawella, the Cornish emigrant. And it is as though he used his time in Australia as a kind of cathartic experience to reflect upon the trauma of his time in Cornwall. And I think, and I kind of end on that note in the book, that although his time in Cornwall was relatively short, his experience there really shaped the nature of the rest of his life. And he never quite got over his nostalgia for Cornwall or the shock of his expulsion, despite the fact that he was able to pour it all out in his cathartic book, Kangaroo. Well, if all that doesn't sound too bonkers, you can catch up with it in the book itself. Not too long, as you can see. I only write short books these days because I have learned that people don't read long books. So best to stick to short ones. And there we are. I'm going to have a rest now.
I think you have definitely earned that rest. Thank you so much, Philip. It's been absolutely fascinating. I've also I'm joined by some of my family members in the side as well. And so it's been we've at various different points. There's been all kinds of like, oh my goodness, and no way, and various different exclamations. I feel like you've taught us a huge amount actually about D.H. Lawrence that a lot of us didn't realize, and the idea of him being expelled from Cornwall as well, that feels really quite shocking actually. And and I don't know, yeah, just some very interesting and complicated questions that you're raising. I want to open up to the floor. I obviously have questions I'm very keen to ask, but I'm also really aware that we've got a whole bunch of people and we probably will have questions here too. So I'm going to switch the recording off now.